The morning of April 11th, 1978 started the way most April mornings did in Marshall County, Iowa. Cold, gray, the kind of sky that couldn't decide whether to rain or just threaten it. The smell of turned earth and diesel hung in the air the way it always did at planting time, and the fields on either side of County Road 14 stretched out flat and dark, and waiting the way Iowa fields have always stretched, patient and indifferent and vast. Colt Merritt was standing at the edge of the east field when he heard the truck. He heard it before he saw it, the low rumble of a heavy diesel engine working through the gears, the particular sound a loaded semi makes when it's moving slow and careful down a gravel road it doesn't entirely trust. He turned toward the sound and shielded his eyes against the pale morning light, and he felt something rise in his chest, something that had been building for months. Pride, maybe. Or the feeling that comes just before pride, that tightening feeling of a man who has made a decision and is finally watching it become real. The truck was red, a Peterbilt pulling a flatbed trailer, and on that trailer, chained down and gleaming even under the gray Iowa sky, were two brand new John Deere tractors, a 4440 and a 4240, 130 horsepower and 100 horsepower respectively. Green paint so fresh it almost hurt to look at. Cab with air conditioning, power shift transmission, the kind of equipment that made everything Colt had been raised on look like it belonged in a museum. He watched the truck slow as it reached the mouth of the gravel drive that led through the oak trees toward the farmhouse and the big red barn. He watched it stop. He frowned. The oak trees weren't that low. Pete Carson, who had driven that route before and knew the clearance, should have kept moving. Colt started walking toward the drive. He didn't understand yet. He would very soon. But in that moment, walking across the edge of his field toward a truck that had stopped for reasons he couldn't explain, Colt Merritt was still a man who believed the next hour was going to be one of the best hours of his life. He was wrong. Standing in the middle of that gravel drive 70 yards from where the truck had stopped was a 73-year-old man in a canvas work coat and mud-caked boots. His arms were at his sides. His face was set in an expression that anyone who had ever known him would have recognized immediately. Not anger exactly, something quieter and more permanent than anger. His name was Harlan Merritt, and he was not moving. To understand what happened that morning, you need to understand what kind of man Harlan Merritt was. Not the surface of him, not the canvas coat and the bad knees and the arthritic hands that could still rebuild a hydraulic pump from memory. You need to understand the thing underneath all of that. The thing that had been forged somewhere deep in the past in a moment that most people who knew Harlan had never heard about, because Harlan was not a man who explained himself often or easily. He was born in 1905 in a farmhouse 3 miles from the one he would eventually own outright. His father farmed 160 acres on the western edge of Marshall County, and those 160 acres were good land, black Iowa topsoil over limestone, the kind of ground that rewards a man who works it with patience and care. His father was a patient man, a careful man, a man who understood in the way that farmers of that generation understood things, that the land was not a commodity to be leveraged. It was a living thing to be tended. Then the 1920s happened, the boom years, commodity prices rising, land values climbing, the agricultural lending industry operating on the absolute conviction that what had gone up would keep going up. Harlan's father, like thousands of farmers across the Midwest, borrowed, not recklessly, carefully by his own lights. He borrowed to expand, to buy equipment, to modernize. He borrowed the way every responsible farmer of the era was borrowing, because the numbers made sense, and the bankers said the numbers would keep making sense, and there was no particular reason in the spring of 1926 to believe they were wrong. Harlan was 21 years old when the decade turned. He was 27 in 1932, standing in a cold kitchen, watching his father sign papers that transferred 160 acres of Merritt land to a bank in Des Moines in exchange for the cancellation of debts that the collapsed commodity market had made impossible to service. His father didn't cry. That would have been easier to watch. He just signed slowly and carefully, the way he did everything. And then he set the pen down and he looked at his hands for a long moment. And then he looked up at his son and he said nothing at all. He didn't need to. The look on his face said everything that needed to be said about what debt could do to a man when the world stopped cooperating with his plans. Harlan never forgot that look. He spent the next 46 years building the Merritt farm back up from the 160 acres his father had managed to keep. Slowly, methodically, a few acres at a time purchased with cash that had been saved through seasons of discipline so strict it bordered on punishment. He bought used equipment and fixed it himself. He ran tractors until they could not be repaired by any method known to man, and then he bought other used tractors and fixed those too. He took no loans for equipment. Not ever. Not once in 46 years of farming. By 1978, the Merritt farm was 640 acres, worth over $1 million, completely, entirely, absolutely debt-free. That was the man standing in the driveway. Colt Merritt had grown up in the shadow of that history without fully understanding what the shadow meant. He knew the facts. He had heard the story of his grandfather's land loss the way all children hear the defining stories of their families often enough that the words became familiar before the meaning did. He knew his father didn't borrow for equipment. He knew why in the way you know things that you have been told but have not yet experienced. But knowing a thing and understanding a thing are not the same. Colt was 34 years old in 1978. He had gone to Iowa State, majored in agricultural business, and come home with a mind full of ideas that he believed in with the particular confidence of a young man who has been educated into certainty. He believed in capital efficiency. He believed in economies of scale. He believed in the principle taught to him by professors who had studied it carefully that debt properly deployed was not a danger but a tool, a lever, a way to multiply the returns on assets that were already working for you. He also believed, and this was important, that his father had done something remarkable. He was not dismissive of Harlan. He respected the old man deeply in the complicated way that sons respect fathers who have set standards that feel both admirable and impossible. But he believed with the quiet certainty of his generation that the methods that had worked for Harlan in 1940 and 1950 and 1960 were not the methods that would work in 1978, that the world had changed, that farming had changed, that staying still was its own kind of risk. In March of 1978, Harlan called him into the kitchen. He was stepping back, he said. His knees were finished. His hands had arthritis bad enough that certain tasks had become genuinely impossible. He wanted to slow down, and the farm needed someone who could give it full attention. He slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It was not complicated. It laid out the terms of the transfer in plain language. Colt would take over the operation of the farm. He would make all management decisions. The land would remain in Harlan's name until it passed to Colt formally, but operationally it was Colt's to run. There was one condition. Harlan put his finger on a single sentence near the bottom of the page. No debt for equipment, not a loan, not a lease, not a note, nothing. You want new equipment, you save for it. You want to expand, you do it slow with cash. This farm has been debt-free for 43 years and it stays that way. Colt read the sentence. He nodded. He said he understood. He meant it when he said it. He genuinely meant it. He picked up the pen and signed his name at the bottom of the page. He did not tell his father about the conversation he had already had with Wade Hollister. Wade Hollister was 38 years old and he was very good at his job. His job technically was selling farm equipment for the John Deere dealership in Marshalltown. But that description undersells it. Wade did not merely sell equipment. Wade sold a vision of what a farm could be. He sold the gap between where you were and where you could be, and then he sold you the machinery that would close that gap, and he did it with the easy fluency of a man who had been practicing the craft for 15 years and had gotten very, very good at it. He had first approached Colt in February, 2 weeks before the kitchen conversation with Harlan. A casual meeting. Technically, Colt had come into the dealership to price out a replacement part for the old 4020, and Wade had been there, and they had started talking, and the talking had gone on for an hour and a half. Wade had walked him around the floor. He had shown him the 4440 machine so far beyond anything currently sitting in the Merritt equipment shed that it seemed to belong to a different era entirely. 130 horsepower, turbocharged diesel, power shift transmission that meant no more clutching through gear changes in the middle of a field, a cab with actual air conditioning and an AM radio. Then Wade had walked him over to his desk and shown him a different kind of machine, a spreadsheet. 640 acres, Wade said, working his pen down the column. Average yield 115 bushels per acre. Current price, call it $220 per bushel. That's roughly $162,000 in gross revenue. Operating costs, seed, fertilizer, fuel, chemicals, call it $80,000. That leaves you $82,000 before equipment costs. He drew a line. Monthly payment on both tractors, 10-year note at 9.5%, $1,100 a month. That's $13,200 a year. You net close to $69,000 after payments. In a normal year, he looked up. You're farming 640 acres, he said. You'll cover that payment easy even in a bad year. And in good years, you'll make enough from increased efficiency to pay it off early. Colt had taken the paper home. He had rebuilt the spreadsheet himself on his own legal pad, checking Wade's numbers and running them 3 different ways. The numbers held. By any reasonable calculation, the tractors made financial sense. The math supported the decision. What Colt did not put on his spreadsheet, and this is the thing that matters, is a drought scenario. He did not model what happened if yields dropped to 90 bushels per acre instead of 115. He did not calculate what happened to his margin if corn prices fell from $2.20 to $1.80. He did not stress test his numbers against a year when both things happened at once, or against a year when a major equipment failure added several $1,000s to his costs at the worst possible moment. He was capable of doing all of this. He had learned how in college. He knew these were the right questions to ask. He didn't ask them, not because he forgot, because he already knew what he wanted to do and he didn't want the numbers to argue with him. So he built a spreadsheet that confirmed what he had already decided, and he called it analysis. This is the thing he would not fully understand about himself for another year, that his mistake was not simply trusting a salesman. His mistake began earlier and ran deeper. He had fooled himself first and then found someone who was happy to help him stay fooled. He signed the purchase agreement for both tractors in the 3rd week of March, 4 days after he had signed his father's transfer document. What Colt did not know on the day he signed that agreement was what had happened 10 days earlier in a conference room above the John Deere dealership in Marshalltown. It was not a large meeting. Wade Hollister, the dealership owner, and a representative from one of the agricultural lending institutions that financed equipment purchases. Standard quarterly business review. Numbers, projections, upcoming promotions. Near the end of the meeting, the lending representative had raised something that was not on the agenda. He had been at a conference in Chicago the previous month, he said, and there had been some discussion among people who track these things, monetary policy people, Federal Reserve watchers, about where interest rates were headed. The Fed had been fighting inflation for years. Some of the signals suggested they might be about to get more aggressive about it. Meaningfully more aggressive. Rates could move significantly, he said, within the next 2 or 3 years. If that happened, he noted it would change the math for a lot of the farm loans they were currently writing. Wade Hollister had nodded. He had asked a few clarifying questions. He had thanked the representative for sharing the information. Then he had driven back to the dealership and continued selling tractors. He did not mention what he had heard to any of his customers. He did not mention it to Colt Merritt when he went over the financing terms. He did not suggest that anyone factor rising interest rates into their long-term debt calculations. He did not slow down the pace of his sales. His income was based on commission. Every tractor sold was money in his pocket, whether the farmer who bought it succeeded or failed. The risk of the loan was the bank's problem. The risk of the harvest was the farmer's problem. Wade's problem was closing deals, and he was very good at solving that problem. He would in 1978 alone sell equipment packages similar to Colt's to 12 other young farmers across Marshall County. Colt did not know any of this. He had a signed purchase agreement and a delivery date, and a feeling in his chest that he recognized that he had been chasing for years, the feeling of finally doing the thing he had been planning to do. He had not yet told his father. The conversation happened on a Tuesday evening in late March in the same kitchen where Colt had signed the transfer document 3 weeks earlier. Harlan was at the table with a cup of coffee when Colt came in. The kitchen was warm. It smelled like the coffee and the particular smell of old wood that the farmhouse had always had, something that existed in no other place on earth and that Colt had stopped noticing years ago, the way you stop noticing the smell of your own home. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he sat down across from his father. He said he had ordered 2 tractors. He got the words out cleanly without hedging the way he had practiced. A John Deere 4.40 and a 4.240. 10-year note at 9.5%, monthly payments of $1,100. He had run the numbers carefully. The farm could service the debt comfortably in a normal year, and even in a down year, the margins held. He stopped talking. Harlan had not moved during any of this. He was looking at his coffee cup. His hands were on the table folded, the knuckles swollen with arthritis, the skin dark from 46 years of working outdoors in every season Iowa had to offer. He was quiet for a long time. Then he picked up his coffee cup. He set it down, and he looked at his son. How much, he said. His voice was low and very flat. 85,000, Colt said. For both. The silence that followed had weight to it. It was not the silence of a man searching for words. It was the silence of a man who had found all the words he needed and was deciding which ones to use. When Harlan spoke again, his voice was still low, still flat. But something else was in it now, something old and certain and not open to argument. I told you one thing, he said. One condition, not 10 conditions, not a list of rules. One sentence on one piece of paper that you signed your name to. And you walked out of that kitchen, and 3 weeks later, you put $85,000 of debt on a farm that your grandfather and I spent 46 years keeping free of it. Colt started to speak. Harlan raised one hand slightly, and the gesture was quiet enough that it shouldn't have stopped anyone. But it stopped Colt. You want to tell me about efficiency, Harlan said. You want to tell me about economies of scale and horsepower and what kind of tractor a modern farm requires. I know what you're going to say because I've heard it before from men who knew more about numbers than you do and lost everything they had. So I'm going to tell you something instead. He leaned forward slightly. Debt doesn't care what your projections are, he said. It doesn't care about your best year or your average year. It only cares about your worst year. And in 46 years of farming, I have learned that the worst year always comes, always. The only question is whether it finds you with room to breathe or whether it finds you with your back against a wall. He pushed back from the table. Cancel the order, he said, and he walked out of the kitchen. Colt sat at the table alone. Outside through the kitchen window, the fields were dark and cold and waiting the way they always were at that hour in March. He looked at them for a while. He thought about what his father had said. He thought about the spreadsheet on his legal pad, the numbers he had run 3 times, the payments that worked out to $1,100 a month on an operation that grossed over $160,000. He did not cancel the order. The morning of April 11th came on a Tuesday. Colt had gone into Marshalltown for parts, a fitting for the old 4020's hydraulic system, a mundane errand on what was supposed to be a significant day. He expected to be back at the farm by mid-morning after the tractors had been delivered and unloaded, and he had allowed himself to think about that moment. The way the new green paint would look against the dark soil of the yard. The way it would feel to climb up into the cab of a machine that actually fit the scale of the work that needed to be done. He was 20 minutes down the road when his radio crackled with a message from Wade Hollister. Call me, Wade said. There's a situation. He called. The delivery driver, Pete Carden, had been stopped. Harlan Merritt was standing in the middle of the driveway, and he was refusing to let the truck onto the property. Pete wasn't sure what to do. Wade was already on his way. Colt drove back. By the time he pulled down County Road 14, Wade's pickup was already parked at the mouth of the drive, and Pete Carson's Peterbilt sat behind it, engine running, the 2 new tractors gleaming on the flatbed like something from an advertisement. 3 men were standing at the edge of the gravel, Pete, Wade, and between them and the farmhouse, at a point roughly 60 yards up the drive, Harlan Merritt. Colt got out of his truck. He walked toward his father, and the closer he got, the clearer the old man's expression became. He had seen that expression before, not often, but often enough. It was not anger. It was something that Harlan Merritt used when anger was not an efficient tool for what needed to be done. It was resolve. Final, absolute, and beyond the reach of any argument Colt was capable of making. Dad, he said, what are you doing? This is my property, Harlan said, and I'm not letting that equipment onto it. Wade stepped forward. Colt could tell from his face that he had already tried talking, and it had not worked. Mr. Merritt, he said, trying to find a register between professional and conciliatory. I understand your concern, but the paperwork is signed. The loan is approved. These tractors legally belong to your son, and the delivery address is... Harlan turned and looked at Wade. The look lasted about 3 seconds. Wade stopped talking. You sold my son $85,000 of equipment, He doesn't need, Harlan said. You did it knowing I would never have approved it. If you want to help, get back in your truck and get off my land. Otherwise, stand there and be quiet. Wade opened his mouth. Then he closed it. The standoff lasted 40 minutes. During those 40 minutes, Colt made every argument he had. He talked about the paperwork and the legality and the fact that Harlan had agreed to let him run the operation. He talked about efficiency and scale and the direction that modern farming was heading. He raised his voice. He lowered it. He appealed to reason and then to something closer to desperation. He reminded his father of his own words that the farm was Colt's to run. I said you could farm the land, Harlan said. I didn't say you could leverage it. There's a difference. I said you could run the operation, Harlan said. I didn't say you could mortgage it. There's a difference. I said no debt for equipment, Harlan said. You signed the paper. There's a difference between signing something and meaning it. Each time, Harlan's voice was the same. Low, flat, and absolutely without the quality of a man who was still deciding. He had decided. That decision had been made. Colt would eventually learn much longer ago than anyone knew. Wade, reading the situation with the professional clarity of a man whose commission was disappearing by the minute, finally made the call. He told Pete Carson to take the tractors back to the dealership lot. Pete, who had been silent through all of it, with the practiced neutrality of a man who has spent 15 years delivering things into other people's disputes, nodded. He climbed back into the Peterbilt. He started the long process of turning a loaded semi around on a gravel drive. The sound of the engine changed, and the big trailer shifted, and the two green tractors moved slowly backward, away from the farmhouse, away from the barn, away from the fields they were meant to work. Colt watched them go. He didn't say anything for a moment. Wade was already retreating to his truck, pulling out his phone, managing the logistics of a deal that had been delivered and undelivered in the same morning. Pete Carson was easing the Peterbilt back onto County Road 14. The rumble of the engine faded. When Colt finally looked at his father, he felt something that was partly humiliation and partly a kind of fury that he hadn't felt since adolescence. In front of a salesman, in front of a truck driver, like a child who had been sent to his room. This isn't finished, he said. Harlan looked at him steadily. No, he said. I don't suppose it is. Colt drove back into town. He rented a storage shed from a neighbor 5 miles east, $200 a month. He called Wade and arranged a second delivery to the new address. He took out a small operating loan to cover his startup costs for the season because his cash was tighter than he had planned for. He added another $12,000 to his total debt by also signing a financing agreement for a new planter, an item he had not mentioned to his father and did not mention to him now. His total outstanding debt as of mid-April 1978 was more than $110,000. He farmed the Merritt's 640 acres with the new John Deere equipment, driving back and forth from the rented shed 5 miles away, adding that time and that diesel cost to every working day of the season. He told himself his father would see. He told himself the numbers would prove him right. He told himself that one good year of modern, efficient, large-scale production would settle the argument better than any conversation could. He sat in the cab of the 4440 in the air conditioning with the radio on, watching the planting monitor show him data in real time, covering ground faster than he had ever covered it, and he felt through the humiliation and the anger and the grinding awareness of the debt waiting beneath everything like bedrock, a flicker of something he could almost call certainty. He was right. He had to be right. 3 weeks passed before he and his father spoke again, not because they were avoiding each other exactly, but because neither of them had found words yet for what had happened in that driveway, and until they did, the silence seemed safer than anything else available to them. The fields waited the way Iowa fields always wait, patient and enormous and quietly indifferent to what the men farming them were feeling about each other. The corn went in the ground. The planting monitor blinked its data. The 4440's engine ran smooth and strong and expensive. And 40 miles away, in a conference room in Des Moines, men in suits discussed Federal Reserve policy in voices that would not reach Marshall County for another 3 years. But when they did, they would arrive all at once, and they would arrive like weather. The spring of 1978 was kind to Marshall County in the way that springs sometimes are in Iowa, deceptively beautifully kind, the kind that makes a man believe he has made good decisions. May came in warm and cooperative. The soil temperature climbed early, hitting the threshold for corn germination ahead of schedule, which meant Colt could get the new planter in the ground before his neighbors had finished their equipment checks. That was the first thing he noticed about modern equipment, not just the power, but the speed. The 4440 covered ground the way the old 4010 never had, smooth and relentless. The planting monitor counting off acres in real time, while the cab stayed cool and the radio played something he wasn't really listening to because he was watching the numbers, and the numbers were good. He planted all 640 acres in corn that year with a small soybean rotation on the southeast quarter. He did it in less time than it had ever been done on the Merritt farm, and when he was finished, he drove back to the rented shed 5 miles east, parked the 4440 in the dim interior that smelled of someone else's oil and rust, and he sat in the cab for a moment before climbing down. The shed cost him $200 a month. The operating loan he had taken out to cover startup costs was sitting at 12% interest on a 6-month note. The planter he had financed without telling Harlan added $412 to his monthly payment obligations on top of the $1,100 for the tractors. Total monthly debt service, $1,512. He had done the math again. It still worked. In a normal year with corn at 220 and yields anywhere near his projections, it worked clearly and comfortably. The numbers were solid. He had run them 4 times. He drove home with the windows down past the fields he had just planted, and he tried not to think about his father watching from the farmhouse at the end of the lane, the way he sometimes saw the old man standing at the edge of the yard in the evenings looking out at the fields, the way he had always looked at them, not with satisfaction exactly, but with the particular attention of a man who is reading something most people can't see. They were speaking by then. Not easily, not warmly, but speaking. The anger from the driveway had not gone away. It had just settled into something lower and more durable, the way hard feelings do when there's no resolution available and life has to continue regardless. They talked about the farm. They talked about the weather. They did not talk about the tractors or the debt or what had happened in April. Harlan had not asked how the planning was going. Colt had not volunteered. June arrived and the weather changed. It didn't change dramatically. That was the thing about it. It was not a catastrophe from the first day. It was a gradual withdrawal, a slow subtraction of something that should have been there. The rains that were supposed to come in the second week of June came light and brief, not enough to do the work that June rains needed to do. The third week was dry. The fourth week was dry and warm, the kind of warm that looks pleasant from a farmhouse window, but means something different entirely when you're standing in a cornfield counting the inner nodes on a stalk that isn't growing the way it should. Colt noticed it the way all farmers notice drought, first as a vague unease, then as a pattern, then as a fact. He called the agronomist he had hired in April. The man's name was Blevins, and he worked on commission from the fertilizer company, whose products he recommended a detail that Colt had registered and then set aside because Blevins had good credentials and an authoritative manner, and the recommendations he made sounded to a man who had studied agricultural business at Iowa State like the kind of careful, data-driven advice that modern farming ran on. Blevins came out and walked the fields. He looked at the plants. He took soil samples. He looked at the sky for a moment in the way that agronomists look at the sky when they are buying time to formulate a recommendation they have already made. You need to push the nitrogen, Blevins said. Stressed corn needs nitrogen. It's trying to compensate for the moisture deficit, and it's pulling from the soil faster than you think. We go heavy now. We stay ahead of the curve. The cost of the additional fertilizer application was added to Colt's operating expenses. He authorized it because Blevins was the expert, and the expert said this was the right call. He would spend a lot of time later thinking about that conversation. Roy Dunbar farmed 320 acres on the north side of County Road 14, roughly a mile from the Merritt farm. He was 53 years old, a quiet man with large hands and a habit of arriving at conclusions slowly and holding them firmly once he arrived. His equipment was older than anything currently running on the Merritt operation, a 402. Oh, that had been old when Roy bought it used in 1971, a set of implements that had been repaired and re-repaired until some of them were more weld than original steel. He owed nothing on any of it. His yields were consistently good. Colt had noticed this in a general wattic without paying it particular attention. Roy was a capable farmer. Everyone in the county knew that. In a season with normal rainfall, the difference in productivity between Roy's old equipment and Colt's new machinery would have shown clearly in the field. Roy planted slower. He cultivated with less precision. His planter spacing was not as accurate as the monitor-controlled system on the 4440. In a normal year, these things added up. This was not a normal year. In mid-July, Colt drove the county road north and stopped at the fence line between his property and Roy's. He had been watching his own corn stressed, yellowing slightly at the tips, the nitrogen burn from Blevins's heavy application showing up now in the way Colt hadn't expected. The fertilizer that was supposed to compensate for the drought, now compounding the damage because the plants didn't have the moisture to process it. His corn was struggling in a way that made the planting monitor and the power shift transmission and the air conditioning in the cab feel suddenly irrelevant. Roy's corn was different. He stood at the fence for a while looking. Roy's stalks were shorter slightly. His rows were not as precise, but the plants were green. Genuinely green, not the yellow-edged green of stressed corn, but the deep saturated green of corn that is doing what corn is supposed to do. Fewer inputs, clearly lighter fertilizer application. Colt could tell from the color pattern, and where Roy had a small irrigation system running on his Southeast 40, it had been applied with the kind of restraint that meant the soil was moist without being saturated. His corn was better. Colt stood at that fence for longer than made sense, and then he crossed the road and drove his truck down Roy's lane and knocked on the door. Roy answered in his work clothes. He looked at Colt with the neutral expression of a man who doesn't waste time being surprised. "Come in," he said. They sat at Roy's kitchen table with coffee, and Colt asked the question directly the way he had been raised to ask questions even when they were uncomfortable. "How are you managing moisture? What's your nitrogen strategy in a dry year?" Roy listened to the questions. He wrapped both hands around his mug. He looked out the window at his fields for a moment before he answered. "I'm not doing anything complicated," he said. "Light application, early, watch the plant. Don't chase the problem with inputs when the inputs need water to work. Let the corn do what corn wants to do." He paused. "Most of what I know about managing a dry year," he said, "I learned from your father." Colt looked up. Roy said it simply without drama or emphasis in the voice of a man stating a fact. Harlan Merritt had been Roy's neighbor since 1965. In the early years before Roy had developed his own instincts, Harlan had been generous with his knowledge, in the specific way that certain older farmers are generous, not lecturing, not advising, but answering questions fully when they were asked. Roy had asked a lot of questions. He had listened carefully to the answers. Over 15 years, he had built a farming practice that was in its fundamentals a version of what Harlan had taught him. Conservative inputs, low overhead, no debt. Survive the bad years, and the good years take care of themselves. Colt drove home. He did not speak to anyone for the rest of that evening. He sat on the porch of the farmhouse after dark, and he looked at his fields, and he thought about Roy Dunbar's corn. He thought about the fact that the man farming 320 acres with a used tractor he had bought in 1971 was outperforming him on a per-acre basis with a fraction of his input costs and none of his overhead. He thought about the agronomist who worked on commission. He thought about the fertilizer bill. He thought about $1,512 every month, regardless of what the weather did, or what the market did, or what any of it did. He sat on the porch until the fields disappeared into the dark, and there was nothing left to look at, and then he went inside. He did not sleep well that night, or many nights that followed. The turbocharger on the 4440 started making a sound in the third week of August. It was a faint sound at first, the kind of thing you hear, and then tell yourself you didn't hear the kind of thing that exists at the edge of normal machinery noise, and that a man who wants to believe everything is fine can for a few days convince himself is nothing. Colt heard it on a Tuesday. By Thursday, it was clearer. By Saturday, it was impossible to ignore a high-pitched whine with a roughness underneath it, the sound of something turning that should not be turning that way. He drove the 4440 the 5 miles to the rented shed and parked it. He called Wade Hollister. Wade came out on Monday. He walked around the tractor. He listened to the engine. He had a look underneath. He stood up and wiped his hands on a shop rag and told Colt what he had found in the professional tone of a man delivering a verdict he has delivered before. "Turbocharger failure," he said. "The bearings are shot." Oil coking in the bearing housing happens when you shut the engine down without letting it cool properly. Turbo's still spinning when the oil stops flowing, and the residual heat burns the oil into a varnish on the bearings. Eventually, they seize. Colt looked at him. "I've been letting it cool down," he said. Wade nodded in the way that does not mean agreement. "That's what most guys say," he said. "But it only takes a few times. Once or twice you're in a hurry, you shut it off too fast, the damage accumulates." "What's the warranty situation?" Colt said. Wade's expression shifted in a way that was small but legible to anyone paying attention. "Operator error," he said. "Warranty doesn't cover operator error." The repair estimate was $3,200. Colt drove home with that number sitting on the passenger seat beside him like a passenger he hadn't invited. He had $3,200 in operating reserves technically. He had been counting that money for a different purpose, for the end-of-season obligations that were coming, the operating loan repayment, the property taxes, the inputs bill that was still partly open. The $3,200 existed in his accounts, but it was already spoken for 3 times over. He called Harold Vick. Harold was an independent mechanic who had worked on farm equipment in Marshall County for 22 years. He operated out of a metal building on his property east of Albion, and he had a reputation for knowing exactly what was wrong with a machine and saying so without any particular regard for whose feelings his assessment might complicate. He charged fair rates, and he did not soften his opinions. He drove out the next morning. He spent 2 hours with the 4440. He had Colt run the engine while he listened, and then he shut it down and put a bore scope into places that required some patience to reach, and then he came out from underneath and sat on an overturned bucket and looked at Colt with an expression that was not unkind but was not soft either. "The bearing failure is real," Harold said, "but the cause isn't what they told you." He explained it in the plain language of a man who has a commission riding on what he's about to say. This turbocharger was part of a production batch from the factory. He had seen 2 others from the same batch in the last 18 months, both with the same failure mode. The bearing housing had a casting defect, a microscopic void in the metal that allowed heat to concentrate in a way the design didn't account for. Under normal operating conditions, the defect would eventually cause bearing failure, regardless of how carefully the engine was shut down. It was a manufacturing problem, not an operator problem. John Deere knew about it, Harold said. There had been internal discussion. There had not yet been a formal recall or a service bulletin. Colt sat with that for a moment. "So the warranty denial," he said, "is wrong," Harold said, "in my professional opinion, but proving it would require documentation I don't have, and that they're not going to hand you voluntarily. What would it cost to fight it?" Colt said. Harold looked at him. "You'd need a lawyer," he said. "A good one, not cheap." Colt thought about his operating reserves. He thought about the number 3,200. He thought about the lawyer's retainer that would sit on top of that number like a second story on a house he couldn't afford to build the first floor of. He went to the bank. He asked for a short-term note to cover the repair. They approved it at 12% payable within 6 months. He sat in the loan officer's chair and signed the paperwork and drove back to the farm, and he thought about something his father had said in the kitchen in March, in the low, flat voice that Harlan used when he wasn't arguing anymore, when he had moved past argument into something simpler and harder. Debt doesn't care about circumstances. It just sits there demanding payment. He had understood those words in March the way you understand words in a language you've studied, but don't speak correctly, but not fluently. He was beginning to understand them differently now, beginning to hear them in the language that only experience teaches. Harvest came in October the way it always does, indifferent to everything that has happened in the months preceding it. Colt ran the combine across his 640 acres through 2 weeks of October weather that was good enough, cool, mostly dry, the kind of harvest conditions a farmer is grateful for when everything else has gone sideways. The 4440 repaired ran without complaint. The combine worked. The grain cart moved between fields and the elevator truck moved between the cart and the grain bins, and the whole operation performed the way it was designed to perform. The yields came in at 96 bushels per acre. He had built his financial model on 115. The corn price on the day he sold the majority of his crop was $2 even. He had modeled 220. He sat at the kitchen table in the farmhouse, his kitchen table now technically the one he had eaten breakfast at since he was old enough to sit in a chair, and he did the math on a yellow legal pad. The same kind of legal pad he had used in February when he had run Wade Hollister's numbers 3 times and found them solid. 640 acres, 96 bushels per acre, $2 a bushel, gross revenue $122,880. Operating costs seed fertilizer including Blevins's heavy nitrogen application that had worsened rather than helped his stressed corn fuel for the bigger equipment that burned more diesel per acre than the old machines, chemicals, the elevator fees, the shed rental at $200 a month, $85,000. Net before debt service, $37,880. Equipment payments for the year 2 tractors plus the planter all financed $18,144. Repair loan payment, $3,200 plus interest. Net after all of it, $16,484. On 640 acres, a full year of farming, a year in which he had planted every available acre run, modern equipment applied expert recommended inputs, done everything right by the standards of the agricultural education he had received. $16,484. He set the pencil down. He thought about Roy Dunbar, 320 acres, half the land, old equipment, no debt. Roy had mentioned his numbers once in passing in the way that farm neighbors sometimes share that information in the abstract. Roy had netted somewhere around $35,000, half the land, more than double the net income. The math sat on the table in front of Colt like an object he didn't know how to pick up. He didn't tell his father the numbers. Not yet. The silence between them had developed its own structure by then, not hostile exactly, but load-bearing. The kind of silence that both people understand is holding something up and neither person is in a hurry to disturb. The night of November 14th was the one that Colt did not talk about for a long time afterward. He had received a document in the mail 3 days earlier. It was from a law firm in Des Moines, not adversarial. It was a financial advisory document, the kind that gets generated when a bank reviews a loan portfolio and identifies accounts that may be approaching a stress threshold. His operating loan was on that list. The document laid out several options for managing his debt load going forward. One of them was the sale of a portion of the farm's acreage. The document described the option in the bloodless language of financial professionals, all passive voice and subordinate clauses. It noted that the East 160 of the Merritt parcel represented, based on current Marshall County land valuations, approximately $288,000 all in asset value. A sale of that parcel, combined with the proceeds applied to outstanding debt, would substantially improve his debt-to-income ratio and position the remaining operation more sustainably for the years ahead. He had set the document on the kitchen table and looked at it for 3 days without touching it again. The East 160. His grandfather had broken that ground in the early 1900s. The creek that ran along its southern edge had a bend in it that Colt had fished as a boy, lying on his stomach on the bank in summer and watching the water run over the limestone shelf below. There was a stand of cottonwoods at the northeast corner that had been there longer than anyone could remember. It was the piece of the farm that had always felt to Colt most essentially like the farm, not because it was the best ground, but because it was the oldest, because it was the piece that held the most. On November 14th, after his wife had gone to bed, Colt sat at the kitchen table with a document and a pen. The numbers made a kind of sense. Not good sense. No version of this made good sense, but a pragmatic, functional sense. Selling the East 160 would clear most of his equipment debt and give the remaining operation room to breathe. It was the rational move. It was the move that a financial advisor looking at his spreadsheets would recommend without hesitation. He picked up the pen. He held it over the signature line. He sat like that for a long time, long enough that the kitchen got cold and he didn't get up to check the thermostat. Long enough that he heard the old farmhouse settle around him, in the way old houses settle at night, making sounds that are almost like a voice if you've lived inside them long enough to know the difference. He was thinking about what Harlan had said in the kitchen in March, and he was thinking about it the way you think about something after it has stopped being an argument and started being a fact. Not the words he had been trying to answer that evening, not the ones about debt and efficiency and the direction of modern farming. A different sentence, the one he had been turning over for months without meaning to. The thing you actually own, Harlan had said, is the thing you don't owe anyone. Colt looked at the East 160 on the legal description in the document. He looked at the signature line. He thought about the cottonwoods at the northeast corner. He thought about his grandfather's hands on a plow he had never seen, but could imagine. He thought about signing his name and what would be on the other side of that signature and whether the thing that would be on the other side of it was the thing he was actually farming for. He set the pen down. He didn't pick it up again. He sat in the cold kitchen until close to 3 in the morning, and then he went to bed without sleeping much, and in the morning he folded the document and put it in the kitchen drawer and made coffee and stood at the window looking at his fields, and he thought about what came next. He had refused one thing, refused to sign away the land his grandfather had broken. But refusing was not the same as solving. The debt was still there. The numbers were still what they were. $16,000 on 640 acres, and next year's planting costs waiting at the edge of the calendar like something that did not intend to wait patiently for long. He thought about his father. He stood at the window for a long time, the coffee cooling in his hand, and he thought about the old man 300 yards up the lane, in the house where Colt had grown up, in the kitchen where they had last talked about money, in a conversation that had ended with Colt walking out and both of them saying things that could not be unsaid. He thought about what it would mean to go back, what it would cost him, whether he could afford what it would cost him given what the alternative had already cost. Outside, the November fields were brown and flat and stripped of everything that had happened to them that year. They looked the same as they had looked in April. Patient, enormous, waiting. He thought about his father's hands on the table in March, the arthritis in the knuckles, the dark skin from 46 years outdoors. He thought about Roy Dunbar's corn green against his own yellowing stalks. He thought about Harold Vicks sitting on an overturned bucket telling him the truth that no one with a commission had been willing to tell him. He thought about the pen he had set down at 3 in the morning and the land that was still his because he had set it down. He finished his coffee. He washed the cup. He put on his coat. He drove up the lane toward the farmhouse. He had not asked his father for help in 20 years. He was about to understand that the kind of help worth asking for is the kind that a person has been preparing to give for longer than you knew there was something to prepare for. He didn't know that yet. He just knew that he had run out of options that didn't involve losing something he couldn't afford to lose. The gravel crunched under his tires. The farmhouse windows were lit from inside the warm yellow light of a kitchen where someone had been up for hours the way Harlan had always been up before first light, moving around the kitchen with the particular unhurried efficiency of a man who has never needed an alarm clock and never will. Colt parked. He sat in the truck for a moment. Then he got out and he walked to the door and he knocked. Harlan opened the door before Colt's knuckles finished their second knock. He was dressed. He was always dressed before first light, work pants, flannel shirt, the suspenders he had worn every day for as long as Colt could remember. He had a cup of coffee in his left hand and an expression on his face that was not surprised and not satisfied and not anything that Colt could name quickly. It was simply open. The expression of a man who has been waiting for something without knowing exactly when it would arrive and has now looked up to find it at the door. "Come in," Harlan said. Colt came in. The kitchen smelled the way it had always smelled, coffee and old wood, and something underneath both of those things that was just the smell of the house itself, the accumulated presence of the family that had lived in it across 4 generations. Colt had grown up breathing that smell without noticing it. He noticed it now. Harlan poured a second cup and set it on the table without being asked, the way he had always set things down precisely without wasted motion. He sat across from Colt the same way he had sat in March, the same chair, the same posture, his arthritic hands folded on the table in front of him. He did not say, "I told you so." He did not say, "I warned you," or "you should have listened," or any version of the words that Colt had been bracing for during the 3-minute drive up the lane. Those words would have been available to him. They would have been accurate. He chose not to use them. Instead, he looked at his son and said quietly and without preamble, "How much did you net?" 16,000, Colt said. "Give or take." Harlan nodded once. "On 640 acres. Yeah." There was a silence. Not uncomfortable or not only uncomfortable. It had something else in it, a quality that Colt would spend years trying to describe accurately and never quite manage. "You want to get out of it," Harlan said. It was not a question exactly. Colt wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. The ceramic was warm. Outside the kitchen window, the pre-dawn dark lay over the fields in the particular way it lies over flat ground in November, complete, and even without the texture that trees or hills would give it. Just dark, and then the flat line, where the dark met the slightly lighter dark of the sky. I don't know how, Colt said. Harlan unfolded his hands. He put them flat on the table for a moment, looking at them briefly the way he sometimes did not, with self-pity, but with the attentiveness of a man who has relied on a tool for so long that he has made a habit of checking its condition. I'll buy the tractors from you, he said. I'll pay off whatever's left on the note and take ownership. Then I'll sell them. Colt looked up. You'll take a loss, Harlan said. The depreciation on a machine that's been in the field one season is significant, and what I get for them at resale won't cover what's left on your loan. The difference comes out of my account. He paused. That's not a loan. It's not something you pay back. It's done, and we don't talk about it again. Colt started to say something, and Harlan raised one hand slightly, the same gesture from the driveway in April, quiet and absolute. I'm not doing it because you earned it, Harlan said. You didn't. I'm doing it because this land has been in this family since 1889, and it's going to stay in this family, and that requires you to still be farming it in 10 years, which means getting you out of a hole that's going to get considerably deeper before it gets shallower if you stay in it. He picked up his coffee. That's the offer, he said. It's the only one I've got. Colt looked at the table. He thought about the document in the kitchen drawer. He thought about the pen he had set down at 3 in the morning. He thought about $16,000 on 640 acres in the months ahead and the debt that did not care about any of it. Okay, he said. His voice was not steady quite, but it was there. Okay, Harlan drove to the bank in Marshalltown on a Wednesday morning in the first week of December. He wore his good coat, not the canvas work coat, but the wool one dark gray that he wore to church and to funerals, and on the occasions when he went somewhere that required him to look like a man conducting serious business because he was. He drove the 1971 pickup that had 140,000 miles on it and ran without complaint because Harlan maintained it with the same systematic attention he applied to everything mechanical that he owned. He paid off Colt's equipment loan. The remaining balance was $79,400, reflecting 11 months of payments that had reduced the principal by a number that would have been discouraging to look at directly, the early years of a high-interest long-term note being almost entirely composed of interest, the principal moving so slowly it appeared sometimes to be standing still. The loan officer who processed the payoff was a man named Gerson Pratt, who had worked at the bank for 19 years and who knew the Merritt family the way small-town bankers know families by their accounts and their history and the character of their decisions across time. He processed the transaction efficiently. Then he paused. There was something he said that he felt Harlan should probably know. He said it carefully in the way of a man navigating the edge between professional discretion and personal conscience, choosing the second. He explained that the loan on Colt's equipment had been originated through a referral arrangement. The John Deere dealership in Marshalltown, specifically the sales representative who had written the deal, had a standing agreement with the bank under which he received a referral fee for each financing package he directed to their institution. A referral fee, Harlan said. Paid per transaction, Pratt said, regardless of outcome. In addition to his sales commission from the manufacturer. Harlan looked at him for a moment. So he made money when Colt signed the purchase agreement, Harlan said. And then he made money again when Colt signed the financing paperwork. Pratt said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Harlan thanked him. He folded his copy of the payoff documentation and put it in his coat pocket. He drove back to the farm on roads he had driven so many times that his hands knew them without being told. He did not tell Colt about the referral fee that day. He waited 2 weeks until the transaction was fully settled and the title to both tractors had transferred to his name, and the emotional weight of the whole arrangement had settled enough that the information could be received as information rather than as additional fuel for a fire that needed to go out, not burn hotter. When he did tell him, Colt sat with it quietly. He had stopped being surprised by Wade Hollister. He had been surprised in August with the turbocharger. He had been surprised again when Harold Vick explained the manufacturing defect. He had spent enough time by December thinking about the structure of the transaction to have already arrived approximately at the place this information was pointing. 2 commissions, Colt said. From 2 directions, Harlan said, with all the risk sitting on your side of the table. Colt was quiet for a while. He thought about Wade in the dealership showroom, easy and fluent, walking him around the floor. He thought about the spreadsheet Wade had shown him, the pen moving down the column of numbers. He thought about the 12 other farmers Wade had sold that year, some of whom he knew by name, men he had grown up around, men whose fields he could see from his own fence line. Was it illegal? Colt said. Harlan shook his head. Probably not. Didn't need to be. He said it without particular bitterness. As a statement of the way things worked, which was its own kind of bitter, if you let it be. But Harlan had not spent 73 years being angry about the way things worked. He had spent 73 years making decisions that did not require him to trust the people who profited from his mistakes. That's the lesson, he said. Not that Wade Hollister is a bad man. Maybe he is, and maybe he isn't. The lesson is that the man selling you something is not the man who lives with what you bought. That's always been true, and it will always be true, and the only protection against it is to not owe money to anyone whose income depends on you owing money. He stood up, he picked up his coffee cup and carried it to the sink. The tractors sell next month, he said. I'll let you know what I get. He sold them in January to a farmer in Tama County who had been looking for a match set and had the cash to pay for them. Harlan got $72,000 for both. His net loss on the transaction after the payoff and the sale was just over $7,000. He recorded it in his farm ledger the way he recorded every transaction, date, amount, purpose. He wrote the number in his careful handwriting and did not circle it or underline it or mark it in any way that indicated it was different from any other entry. It was an expense. It had served its purpose. He turned the page. The spring of 1979 came in cold and stayed that way later than usual. Colt planted the Merritt's 640 acres with the 1960 John Deere 4010 and the 1965 John Deere 4020. He had used these machines before, had learned to drive on the 4010, had put thousands of hours on the 4020 through his teenage years and his 20s, but he had not used them as the primary equipment on a full-scale planting operation in years, and the difference from the previous spring was total. The 4010 covered ground at roughly two-thirds the pace of the 4440. There was no cab, no air conditioning, no planting monitor counting off acres in real time. There was a seat exposed to the April wind off the fields, a throttle and a clutch, and a gear shift that required actual clutching, and the noise of a diesel engine without the sound dampening that modern equipment took for granted. By the end of the first full day of planting, Colt's back hurt, and his hands were stiff, and he had covered considerably less ground than he would have covered in the 4,440. He went home, he ate dinner, he went to bed earlier than he had in years. The next morning he went back out. There was something in that, he would think later, not a lesson he could have been taught, a thing that had to be learned through the specific experience of doing it. The old equipment was slower and harder and less comfortable in every measurable way, but it was paid for. And the particular quality of knowing it was paid for, of sitting in that open cab in the April cold with the diesel noise and the stiff clutch and no monitoring system, and owing nothing on any of it, that quality was not something he had expected to matter the way it mattered. It sat in his chest differently from the way the 4440 had sat, quieter, more stable. He couldn't fully explain it, and for a while he didn't try. In the third week of May, the 4020's hydraulic pump developed a problem. The left remote outlet was losing pressure, not catastrophic, but enough to affect the planter's performance on certain operations. Colt diagnosed it himself correctly and ordered the parts he needed from the dealer in Marshalltown. He came home the next afternoon to find Harlan already in the equipment shed. The old man had pulled the hydraulic pump, which required lying on the cold concrete floor of the shed for a sustained period. He was 73 years old with arthritis in both hands and knees that had been rebuilt twice. He was lying on his back on a piece of cardboard, his arms reaching up into the underside of the 4020. With the focused economy of motion that belonged to someone who had done this specific task many times before and knew exactly where every component was without needing to look. Colt stood in the doorway of the shed and watched. He watched his father's hands moving in the dim light, finding threads by touch, turning fasteners with the careful deliberateness of a man who knows that stripped threads in a hydraulic system are a problem requiring a solution that is worse than the original problem. He watched the old man's face, which was turned slightly sideways and had on it the particular expression of concentration that Colt had seen all his life, not effortful, but complete. The expression of a man for whom this kind of work was not a burden, but a form of thinking. He watched for a while without speaking. Then he got down on the floor beside his father and handed him tools. They worked through the afternoon. Harlan did not offer instruction, and Colt did not ask for it. The communication was the kind that happens between two people with overlapping competence, each aware of what the other is doing and adjusting accordingly. The pump came out, it was inspected. The seal that had failed was replaced along with two others that were close to failing because Harlan replaced adjacent seals on principle when he had a pump apart on the grounds that the labor of accessing them was the expensive part and the seals themselves cost almost nothing. The pump went back in. The hydraulic lines were reconnected. Harlan torqued the fittings with a deliberateness that Colt recognized as the physical expression of a standard, not how tight is tight enough, but how tight is correct. They tested it. The pressure held. Total cost the price of 3 seals and 2 O-rings, less than $12. Harlan got up from the floor with the specific difficulty of a man whose joints had views about cold concrete that they were not keeping to themselves. He stood and looked at the 4020 for a moment. He wiped his hands on a shop rag. He looked at the machine the way he looked at things that had done what they were supposed to do. Runs another season, he said. Maybe 2. He handed Colt the shop rag and walked out of the shed into the late afternoon light. Colt stood in the shed for a moment. He looked at the 4020. He looked at the doorway his father had just walked through. He thought about the $12 in parts and the 4 hours of labor that had solved a problem that a year ago he would have taken to a dealership and paid several $100s to have diagnosed before the repair bill even started. He thought about what that meant across a year, across 5 years, across the 46 years his father had been doing it this way. He hung the shop rag on its nail. He walked out into the light. The 1979 growing season was harder than 1978. The drought that had started the previous summer persisted and deepened through the winter and into spring. Iowa corn yields across the state came in well below average. Colt's fields produced 92 bushels per acre, 4 less than the previous year, which had already been below projection. The corn price held around $2.10 through harvest, slightly better than the year before, but not significantly. He ran the numbers in October with the same legal pad, the same kitchen table. 640 acres, 92 bushels, $2.10. Gross $123,648. Operating costs lower than 1978, meaningfully lower, because the equipment he was running burned less diesel per acre, and because he had not hired an agronomist working on commission, and because his input strategy was conservative in a way that the previous years had not been $67,000. Net before debt service, $56,648. Debt service, 0. Net $56,648. He looked at that number for a while. In a worse year than 1978, with lower yields and lower prices and less land, under optimal conditions, he had netted $56,648, against $16,484 the year before. The difference was not the weather. The weather was worse. The difference was not the yields. The yields were lower. The difference was the debt, and only the debt, and the entire magnitude of that difference, $40,000, was money that had gone the year before to service obligations that had nothing to do with farming and everything to do with the decision he had made in a dealership showroom while a man with 2 commissions arranged numbers on a page to tell a story that ended in Wade Hollister's favor. He slept that night without waking. It was the first time in 14 months. The farm crisis arrived the way most catastrophes arrive in agricultural communities, not all at once, but by accumulation each month, adding weight to a structure that had been under stress for years until the morning when the structure simply did not hold anymore. The Federal Reserve, fighting an inflation rate that had reached into double digits, raised interest rates through 1980 and into 1981 with a determination that the agricultural lending industry had not prepared its clients for. The prime rate hit 21.5% in June of 1981. Farmers who had taken out variable rate operating loans found their interest payments doubling. Farmers who needed to refinance fixed rate equipment debt found the new rates incompatible with the margins their operations could produce. At the same time, commodity prices collapsed. The grain embargo of 1980 combined with a global oversupply pushed corn and soybean prices down sharply. Iowa farmland values, which had continued rising through the late 70s on the assumption that they would continue to rise, began to fall. By 1985, they would be down nearly 50% from their peak. The math that had supported every agricultural loan written between 1974 and 1979, the math that Wade Hollister had shown Colt on a legal pad in a Marshalltown dealership, the math that had been shown in every version of that conversation to every young farmer in every county in Iowa and Indiana and Illinois and Nebraska, that math stopped working. All of it all at once throughout the American Midwest. 235,000 farms went out of business between 1981 and 1987. In Marshall County, Iowa, Colt Merritt watched it happen from the particular vantage point of a man who had been standing close to the edge and been pulled back just in time. He watched auction signs appear on properties he had known since childhood, white placards nailed to fence posts on the county roads, listing dates and times in plain black type. He drove past them on the way to his fields and on the way back, and each one was the end of something. A family's presence on a piece of ground that in some cases went back to the same generation that the Merritt farm went back to men and women losing what their grandparents had built, because the numbers that someone had shown them in a good year had not survived the arrival of a bad one. He knew 7 of them personally. Neighbors meant he had grown up around people whose children had gone to school with him. 5 of them had bought equipment from Wade Hollister in 1977 or 1978. Wade had moved to a dealership in Ames by then and was, as far as Colt knew, still selling. The Merritt farm did not get an auction sign. It did not come close to getting an auction sign. With no equipment debt and a conservative operating approach that kept his annual costs well below the thresholds that were destroying other operations Colt farmed through the crisis years, with a margin that was thin in bad seasons and adequate in good ones. He did not expand. He did not modernize. He ran the 4010 and the 4020 and the implements that Harlan had maintained for decades. And when they needed repair, he repaired them. And when they needed parts, he ordered the parts. And when he could not figure out what was wrong, he drove up the lane and knocked on the farmhouse door. Harlan was there until he wasn't. In the spring of 1985, Harlan Merritt was admitted to the hospital in Marshalltown with a cardiac event that his doctor described with the careful language of a man who knows his patient well enough to be honest is serious. The heart was not failing, so much as informing its owner that 79 years of work had been noted, and that a renegotiation of terms seemed advisable. Harlan did not respond well to this information. He responded to it the way he responded to most things that required him to stop doing something he had always done, with a patience that was not acceptance, and a compliance that was not agreement, and a quietness that the nurses on his ward eventually learned to interpret correctly as the quietness of a man thinking rather than the quietness of a man at rest. Colt drove to the hospital every day. He sat in the chair beside the bed, and they talked the way they had learned to talk across the years since 1978, directly without the circling that had characterized their conversations in the years before everything had been made plain. They talked about the farm, about the fields and the equipment and the decisions ahead. They talked about the crisis unfolding around them, the auction signs on the county roads, the families leaving. They talked about what the farm would look like in 10 years and 20. On a Wednesday afternoon in late October, with the window of the hospital room showing a sky that had gone the particular gray of late Iowa autumn, Colt told his father that he was grateful. He said it without preparation or ceremony. It came out the way true things sometimes come out, not as a speech, but as a sentence arriving without announcement. He said, "I never thanked you for the morning with the truck." Harlan looked at him for a moment. Then he did something Colt had not expected. He shook his head, slowly once. He reached toward the small cabinet beside the hospital bed. His hands moved carefully. The arthritis had progressed over the years. The knuckles larger now, the range of motion reduced, and he opened the cabinet drawer and reached inside and brought out something that Colt had not known existed. It was an envelope, old, genuinely old, the paper gone soft at the edges and yellowed to the color that paper reaches when it has spent decades in a drawer. The envelope was sealed but had been opened at some point and resealed with a strip of tape that had itself gone amber with age. On the front, in Harlan's handwriting, a younger version of the same careful hand that kept the farm ledgers, were 2 words: "For later." Harlan held it out. Colt took it. Harlan said. The letter was 3 pages written in pencil on the lined paper of a composition notebook, the kind sold in five and dime stores in 1952. The handwriting was his father's, unmistakably in every formation of every letter, but younger. Less settled, the handwriting of a man who had not yet arrived at the economy of motion that decades would bring. It was dated November 3rd, 1952. Colt read it at the pace of a man who is reading carefully, who understands partway through the first page that what he is holding requires that kind of reading. In the fall of 1952, Harlan Merritt had been 47 years old, farming 420 acres and facing a decision. The equipment he was running, 2 tractors, both used, both aging, had reached a point where their reliability was genuinely uncertain. The cost of maintaining them was increasing. A new tractor, a proper upgrade, would improve his operation meaningfully. He had done the math. The numbers supported borrowing. He had gone to the bank. He had discussed terms. He had come home with a loan application that required only his signature to initiate the process. That evening he had gone to see his neighbor. The man's name was in the letter, Earl Cogswell, who farmed 280 acres to the west of the Merritt property and who had been Harlan's closest neighbor for 11 years. Earl Cogswell had received that same afternoon a notice of foreclosure. He had borrowed in 1950 to expand and modernize. The loan had made sense in 1950 by the math of 1950. By the math of late 1952, with commodity prices having moved in directions the 1950 projections had not accounted for, it no longer made sense. The bank had been patient. Then the bank had been less patient. Then the bank had sent a letter. Harlan had sat in Earl Cogswell's kitchen and watched his neighbor read that letter a second time, the way people read things they are hoping will say something different on the second reading. He had driven home. He had sat at his own kitchen table alone after his wife and children were in bed, and he had looked at the loan application. He had looked at his neighbor's face in his memory. He had thought about his own father's hands on the table in 1932 signing papers. He had not signed the loan application. Instead, he had taken out the composition notebook and written for a while the way people write when they are trying to clarify something they know but have not yet put into language that will hold. Near the end of the second page, Colt found the sentence. It was not dramatic in its construction. It did not reach for significance. It was written in the same plain declarative prose as everything else in the letter, the prose of a man who trusted clear language and did not dress thoughts in more words than they needed. If the day comes when my son wants to do what I almost did tonight, I need to be the one who stops him, even if he doesn't understand why, even if he's angry with me for it. That's what I owe him, not the freedom to make the mistake I almost made, but the protection from it. Colt sat in the hospital chair and read that sentence twice. Then he sat for a while without reading. Outside the window, the gray Iowa sky held steady. In the hallway, the sounds of the hospital continued: footsteps, a cart moving, a PA system, announcing something in the flat tone that PA systems always use, as if the words don't mean anything in particular, when in fact they always do. He looked up at his father. Harlan was watching him with an expression that was quiet and complete. The expression of a man who has been carrying something for a long time and has now set it down in the right place. You wrote this in 1952, Colt said. Harlan nodded. 26 years, Colt said. Harlan said nothing. He didn't need to. Colt thought about the morning in April of 1978. He had replayed it many times over the 7 years since it happened. The red truck on County Road 14, the gravel drive through the oak trees, his father standing in the middle of the road with his arms at his sides. He had replayed it as an act of stubbornness. He had replayed it as an act of control. He had replayed it in the years since 1979 as an act of love. Now he replayed it as something else, not a decision made in anger or in the heat of a conflict that had been building for years, not a reflex, not even just a principle, a promise, made in a kitchen in 1952 to no one but himself, recorded in a composition notebook, sealed in an envelope, and kept for 26 years with the same faithful attention that Harlan Merritt brought to everything he committed to keeping. The morning of April 11th, 1978, his father in the road, not an old man losing his temper over a son's decision. A man honoring a promise he had made to himself a quarter century before, when he sat alone at night with a loan application and his neighbor's face in his memory and understood something about the future that he could not give his son directly, but could, when the moment came, give him in the only form it could be received, by standing in the road and refusing to move. Dad, Colt said. His voice was not entirely steady. Harlan reached across from the bed and put one hand on Colt's forearm. The hand was heavy and warm, and the grip was not strong. The arthritis had taken most of the grip years ago, but the weight of it was there, and the warmth, and Colt put his own hand over his father's, and they sat like that for a while without speaking, because everything that needed to be said had been said in a letter written in 1952, and in a gravel driveway in 1978, and in all the mornings and seasons between then and now. Harlan Merritt died on a Tuesday morning in December of 1985. He was 80 years old. He died in the hospital in Marshalltown in the early hours before first light, which was when he had always been most awake. And there is something in that timing that Colt has never been able to think about without feeling the particular weight of it, his father leaving at the hour he would normally be starting the day. He left the Merritt farm to Colt in its entirety, 640 acres, Marshall County, Iowa. Continuous family operations since 1889. Debt none. Liens none. Encumbrances of any kind none. The same land that Colt's grandfather had broken from prairie that Harlan had rebuilt and expanded and held through decades of hard seasons and one Great Depression and the sustained pressure of an agricultural economy that had tried in 100 ways to convince him that owing money was the price of being a modern farmer. Not $1 of equipment debt. Not ever. Not once in 46 years of farming. Colt stood in the farmhouse kitchen the morning after his father's death and looked at the fields in the pre-dawn dark, and he thought about the envelope in the hospital drawer and the letter in the composition notebook and the sentence he had read twice in the gray October light. He made coffee. He stood at the window. He let the dark hold its particular shape over the flat ground of Marshall County for as long as it was going to hold it. Then he went to his desk and opened the drawer where he kept the farm documents. He moved things aside until he found a legal pad. He sat down and he picked up a pencil and he thought for a while about what he wanted to write. In the spring of 1990, Colt Merritt bought a tractor. It was a John Deere 443, the same model he had wanted to buy new in 1978. This one had been manufactured in 1975 and had been sold twice before it came to Colt, first to a farm in Benton County, then to a dealer's used lot in Cedar Rapids, where Colt found it in February after 3 weeks of looking. It had 6,400 hours on it. The cab was worn. The paint had faded in the way that green paint fades after 15 years of Iowa weather, going from the aggressive color of new equipment to something quieter and more permanent. It ran well. Harold Vick, who drove up to Cedar Rapids with Colt to inspect it, said the engine was honest and the hydraulics were sound and the hours were real, meaning the machine had been worked but not abused. The price was $22,000. Colt paid cash. He drove it back to the Merritt farm on a February afternoon with the kind of sky that Iowa gets in that month, low gray, the particular gray of a sky that is done with winter but has not yet begun to believe in spring. He pulled into the yard and parked it in the equipment shed next to the 4010 and the 4020 that had gotten him through the crisis years, and he climbed down and stood in the shed and looked at it in the dim light. The model he had wanted 12 years ago. The machine that had existed in his mind as a symbol of everything modern farming was supposed to be, sitting now in his equipment shed, used, paid for, belonging entirely to him and to no one else. He was 46 years old. His father had been dead 5 years. The farm crisis had spent itself and the survivors had begun cautiously to look forward. The auction signs on the county roads had come down mostly. The land values had stopped falling and were beginning in the flat, incremental way of agricultural economics to move the other way. He stood in the shed for a while. Then he went inside. His son Nathan was 14 that year. He had grown up on the Merritt farm the way Colt had grown up on the Merritt farm, working alongside his father since he was old enough to be useful, learning the rhythm of the land and the machinery and the seasons in the way that you can only learn things that you live inside of every day. Nathan was a serious boy, attentive and curious, with his grandfather's quality of observation, the habit of watching things carefully before forming conclusions. He had not known Harlan well, had been too young when Harlan died to carry much direct memory of the man. But he knew the farm, and the farm was full of Harlan in every corner and every practice and every piece of equipment that ran because someone had maintained it correctly. In the evenings, sometimes Colt would tell Nathan about his grandfather. Not the facts Nathan knew, the facts had heard them, but the texture of the man, the way Harlan thought about things, the standards he kept and why he kept them. He told Nathan about the driveway, about the truck. He told him about the letter in the composition notebook, the sentence written in 1952, the promise his father had kept for 26 years. Nathan listened the way he listened to everything carefully, completely, without hurry. One evening he asked his father, "Did you understand why when it was happening?" No, Colt said. "Not even close." "When did you understand it?" "In the hospital." Colt said, "When he gave me the letter." He paused. "But I was starting to understand it before that. I was starting to understand it the night I didn't sign the papers for the East 160. Something my father had said stopped me. I couldn't have told you why it stopped me at the time. I just know it did." Nathan thought about that. Some years later, when Nathan was grown and running the Merritt operation himself, still 640 acres still, Marshall County, still debt-free, he would come to Colt with a question about a piece of equipment he was considering. A newer model, the numbers looked good. The dealer had shown him a spreadsheet. Colt listened to all of it. Then he went to his desk and opened the drawer and moved things aside until he found an envelope. The paper was not as old as Harlan's had been. Not yet, it was only 15 years old, written in the months after Harlan's death, when Colt had sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a pencil and put into words what he had understood in the hospital room and everything he had learned in the years it had taken him to get there. He handed the envelope to his son. On the front, in Colt's handwriting, 2 words: "For later." Nathan looked at the envelope. He looked at his father. He understood from the weight of the moment and the care with which it was being handed to him that what he was holding was not just a letter. It was a practice, a thing that got passed down not because it was written, but because someone had found it valuable enough to write, and someone else had found it valuable enough to keep, and the keeping was itself the lesson that there are things worth carrying forward, worth the deliberate effort of preservation, worth the willingness to look like a stubborn old man in a driveway, if that's what it takes. He took the envelope. He did not open it that evening. He put it in his own desk drawer in the farmhouse that his great-great-grandfather had built on ground that had been in the same family since 1889. He would open it when he needed it. He would know when that was. Outside, the Merritt fields lay in the particular stillness of an Iowa evening patient, an enormous and completely, entirely, absolutely his own. Not the bank's, not a lender's, not a salesman's, not the property of any interest rate or payment schedule or financial instrument designed to transfer risk onto the people who could least afford to carry it. His. The way land is only truly yours when no one else has a claim on it, when it belongs to you and your children and the generations behind them and the ones ahead, free and clear and fully present, the way Harlan Merritt had kept it, and Colt Merritt had kept it, and Nathan Merritt intended to keep it. The way the letter said,